Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Everybody, it's your girl Moriah, and thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC Business News Podcast, powered by the GSMC Podcast Network. Again, I'm your girl Moriah, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to be getting into the discussion of minimum wage. Yes, I know this is a hot topic right now. A lot of debates on Twitter. If you've been on Twitter, hopefully you've been paying attention to some of the news. I normally get on Twitter to de-stress and kind of get some laughs and jokes. But the business podcast it has their own Twitter page. We're always tweeting about some new trends and different things. And one of the topics that I've been closely keeping my eye on is the minimum wage discussion. A lot of people feel different ways about it. Some believe we shouldn't raise the minimum wage as a society, or as a country, I should say, especially in the U.S. Some say we should. Some say other countries, are doing it the right way, and some say some other countries are doing it the wrong way. So you just get a jumbled up view of this issue. And it is an issue because of the different homeless populations around the world and things of that nature. And, those who try to advocate often feel that if we raise the minimum wage, that gives more opportunity. But in my opinion, if we were to raise minimum wage, that may cut out some opportunity, because now if you weren't making that much as a business and you have to now go by federal regulations and you have to raise your minimum wage, you might have been paying an employee $7.25 or $7.50, and now you have to jump to $15. That can bring your business down to its knees, depending on your financials, your status. So it's a lot of different takes on it. So we're gonna briefly scratch the surface on it today. We're gonna talk about that, talk about its history, give you exactly what minimum wage is, understanding it. There is federal versus state wages, and state versus municipal wages, and special considerations. There's pros and cons to having a minimum wage. So we're going to get into all of that today. So right now, I like to kick it off with history. I like to give a good history lesson. So we're going to get into the history of minimum wage. Just to give you that background so that you're not just out here, talking from a place that you're not very educated, right? To make it nice. So let's hop into it, all right? So we're talking about the history of minimum wage in the United States, for those who are wondering. The first minimum wage law was around, I want to say, the 1900s, about 1912, where Massachusetts, they actually set a minimum hourly rate for women and children under 18. Yes, at one point in time, children were able to work. And obviously that is pretty crazy. So, as society moves on, you start to learn better, you do better, or you're forced to do better in some cases. So child labor laws had come into effect some years later. But around that time, back in the early 1900s, there was a minimum wage set. And then eventually, towards the 1940s, the federal government established a minimum wage. And the rate was, I want to say, about a quarter. So for inflation purposes, to bring it current, if it was 2021 and, the government set that minimum wage, you'd be making $4.61. I can't even imagine surviving off of $4.61. But for a lot of people, that's the difference between no food and food, right? Some people, like waitresses, for example, I know a few waitresses, waiters, who wouldn't make more than about $2 an hour, and the rest of their compensation was based off of tips. And if you had a bad night, that check doesn't look so good. So that's just to give you a little bit of an idea of the background of where it started, of where minimum wage was, because at some point, you didn't have to pay people anything. So you can imagine why there is business ethics and why there's ethical boards to different things. Because, in your mind or in some people's minds, you're just making money and you need help. So you ask for help. And to keep you growing, you can't pay your employee the same amount of money that it takes to operate the company, right? If it takes $100,000 for startup, you wouldn't pay your employee $100,000, right? You have to set it at a certain place where you're still making a profit. And I think that's one of the parts that a lot of commentators of the topic don't really understand. So while inflation does occur, yes, and the cost of living does occur, yes, and the cost of living continues to rise, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that minimum wage will rise. Now, whether or not you agree that it should, that's your opinion, and that's solely up to you. And, opinions, I like to quote an old high school teacher, that opinions are not just opinions you pull out of your you-know-what. Opinions are a calculated thought based off of facts that has a little bit of emotion involved. And I paraphrase him. Obviously, that was a few years ago. But I do know that he greatly meant that. And he said it all the time. So this is something that he definitely lived by. An opinion is a calculated thought that's based on facts with a little bit of feelings. So when it comes to these topics, you do want to leave some of the opinion out. I understand that we're going through a lot of things in the world, but you want to keep it based off of the numbers, right? The quote, men lie, women lie, but numbers don't. It's a very true statement. We are humans. We are flawed. So we might add what I like to call pepperoni to the pizza. You just order the cheese pizza, but your emotions get involved and you start tasting that pepperoni and you forgot what it tastes like. You hadn't had pizza in a while, so you add a little extra toppings that you probably don't need. I see this topic as the same way. Let's keep the cheese pizza and keep your toppings to yourself. Because this topic can get very, I've seen it get very heated. Some people feel like, you're a capitalist who wants the world to end because you don't want to raise the minimum wage. And some others are just like, hey, we tried that before and we see what happens. Some experts, I've been reading up on some articles, and some experts say that based upon history and based on how things go, just because you raise the minimum wage does not mean that poverty will disappear. The poor will always be among us. Someone is always going to be making more than someone else. And that's just something basic in the home. Your parents clearly make more than the little toddler, right? Make more than the dog, right? There's always going to be someone who makes a little bit more than someone else. So based off of history, that lets us know that at some point in time, they had to set a minimum wage. You see that the minimum wage was set for women and children. And that's because at the time, some of them weren't getting paid anything. They were told that they would be hired for a certain amount of work. They were told that they would make a certain amount of money. And then when they actually went to go make that money, that did not happen. And so some laws had to get put in place. And that's what you have now. You have a lot of government regulations, that mandates which state should have what and which state is allowed to have what. It all goes back to that, do we really like the involvement of government in business? Well, in this topic, you had to. Because there has to be some type of minimum set. If not, you pay your employee a penny if you are a cruel business owner, in my opinion. But, it's up to your interpretation. So there has to be some type of government regulation. So they learned that back in the early 1900s. Hey, if we're going to have a real true industrial society, there has to be some type of minimum wage set. Now, obviously, again, speaking on the history of minimum wage, this was meant to be the wage that was a living wage. So you would be able to survive or live off of the wage. So if you can think back, I'm sure many of us can think back to a grandparent or even a great grandparent, and you understand that, maybe your grandfather, in some cases your grandma was out there getting to the money, and in most cases the grandfather, the fathers, the dads were out providing for the family, and they were able to live off of minimum wage. That quarter that was set, that 25 cent an hour, right? At a certain time in history, you were able to survive off of that, and that would feed a family of, in some cases, 10. Those families back in the day, they had a lot of kids. I come from one of those families who the matriarchs and of the family and things like that. There's a lot of them. I couldn't imagine having a family of 10. I'm trying to keep up with my dogs because of the cost of living, and because I don't make minimum wage. I'm very grateful for that. But at one point in time, I did make minimum wage, and it wasn't easy. Being even in high school, making the wages set by the employers in high school, that was still hard because, you're trying to learn how to juggle. Your mom or your dad might have put your phone bill back on you, like, hey, okay, every month you got to pay this. Or you might have had a car, so you had to pay for your car and had to buy clothes, had to buy shoes, those little things. It was still a little difficult as a high school student. You couldn't solely survive off of that by yourself. You still needed assistance from whoever you lived with. Now, obviously, some of us have lived in different circumstances, so that might have been something that you had to do, and you weren't able to really see how your money worked for yourself, but you were able to see how it worked for your household. I like to look at the positive in any situation, so I think the minimum wage discussion, it goes into a broader topic, because now you're getting into, well, can people really live off of it? If that's what it was designed for originally, it was designed for those, who were in the labor force, and, there had to be some type of protection over them. And, again, the women and the children, they needed protection because they were getting done pretty dirty by their employers. And it was created to, expressly ensure that people, no matter what skill level you were at, you could find a place of employment to at least get on your feet, to at least establish some stability, to put food on the table, to keep the lights on, to keep the rent or your mortgage paid. You could buy a home off of that. You could send maybe a kid or two to college. You could do those things. And then once the children were of age, you were able to make sure everyone had a job. Could you imagine 10 working adults or 10 working people? Because, children could work as well. There's plenty of cases of children working in the coal mines and children sewing, things of that nature. So you can just imagine that, some of those families were able to sustain during that time. Nowadays, we're talking, I like to say we're in mid-pandemic. Some like to say we're post-pandemic. During this time, is anyone really able to survive off of minimum wage? So with one working adult, without any government assistance, without any borrowing from anyone, without any loans, can you just graduate high school, get a minimum wage job, and live a decent life? Depending on the place that you're in, I'm going to guarantee that it's a no. At least not in the city that I'm in. In Philadelphia, minimum wage does not cover rent. You figure how much are your check. You might work 40 hours. Let's just say every employer is gracious enough to give you 40 hours a week. It's 52 weeks in a year. So 40 times 52 is about 2,080 hours. And then you will multiply that by the 725. You're making about $15,000 a year. About $15,100. You're close to that ballpark. That doesn't cover a lot, right? In most places, rent is $1,400 and up. Depending if you're in places like California, New York, $1,400. That's a deal, and you better hope it's not just a little closet, right? That's the realistic truth of what's going on. So a lot of people are discussing this minimum wage. Have we strayed from where we started, where that was supposed to give balance and stability to the people. And at this point, is it just money-hungry corporations? So that's just a little bit of history about minimum wage. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to give some different examples. The U.S. is not the only place that had minimum wage put in place. A lot of countries have, so we're going to go through a few different countries and just see how they got their start, all right? Stay locked in. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
And again, today we're discussing the minimum wage. There is obviously a wage gap in many places around the world. And in my home country, if you're listening from overseas, shout out to you. Thanks for tuning in. I might be discussing your country coming up. But in my home country of the United States, we have a minimum wage of $7.25 in a lot of places. And in other places you might have you might have closer to $10. You might have closer to maybe 12. It really depends on the area that you live in. It depends on your state. It depends on what what that job is actually willing to offer. A lot of times the minimum wage is set at a certain number, and then that employer is able to offer more per hour depending on the skill set for the job that's needed. So like I mentioned earlier, I might not make minimum wage at this moment, but at any given time, I would be very, very grateful if that's what I had to if that's all I had to fall back on. That was all I could do. I would be very happy. However, I would understand the difference between making above minimum wage and making minimum wage. I was a high school student at one point, and at one point in time, I was just looking for anything that would pay the bills when I was in college. I didn't care what I was doing or how much I was getting, as long as money was coming in. And that's how some families are feeling right now. They're looking for a breath of fresh air. They're looking for some stress release. It's very hard to put food on the table, especially when you're not able to make a certain amount, you're at a disadvantage, you lack education. The minimum wage goes into a lot of different conversations. And I don't think we have time enough today to talk about everything. But the argument that's going on is, should it be raised? Should it not be raised? There's a projection with the United States that the federal minimum wage will be at $15 an hour by 2025. So we're in 2021. There's a few years to go before that takes effect. But again, as we stated earlier, that does not mean that poverty will end because the minimum wage gets increased. If anything, some experts believe that the poverty line, that ceiling will be a bit higher than it was before. Because if the cost of living is really going up, and technically $15 an hour doesn't really match the cost of living adjustments, depending on the reports that you're looking at and the data that you're reading. So it's a very one of my coaches like to call them ticky-tack files. It's one of those ticky-tack things where the way you saw it the way you see it might be one way, the way I see it might be another way, the way the numbers are showing it is something totally different. So let's hop into some different countries. I've talked about the U.S. enough for right now. So let's hop into some different countries and when they got their stamp of the minimum wage. So let's start with the United Kingdom. Minimum wage was a big factor in those industrial relations around the early 1900s. And then I want to say that they kind of followed suit the same with, with the United States towards 1940-ish. A little bit before then, they decided to implement their minimum wage. And, a lot of people were promoting the idea of minimum wage. In the beginning, it started with the farmers. And landowners were being, I want to say, pests. And they did not, sometimes I think opposition is not just these people being evil who don't want to see you win. If anything, you're trying to protect what's yours. So even if you have little to nothing in your name, you're going to do whatever you can in your power to protect that little bit that you have. So if you have a lot, can you imagine how much more you would go, how much more lengths you would go to try and protect what you have. So I think a little bit of that was in the mix as well. So landowners, they were kind of resistant to the change. But, as they say, the liberals, they were kind of promoting this idea that at least there should be some type of minimum wage. If I work this amount of time, there should just be this common ground where I know how much I'm going to make. Again, you could go to work and you could think you were going to get paid. And I've read many stories where, women, children, grown men would have to go home with no pay. And, what are you going to do? Go fight your boss? You need your job. And if back then it wasn't, there was no social media. You couldn't tweet, "This is outrageous. Let's cancel this landowner. He's not paying his employees what they deserve." That wasn't the case at the time. Things were very, very different. So laws had to get put in place and things had to, get stabilized, I should say, to help those in need. And also some landowners at the time, they didn't believe that it was really going to help those who were working. They felt like, okay, they'll see a little bit of growth in their lives, but it's really going to be detrimental to us because we'll be out of business. Again, like I was stating earlier, you can't give your employee everything. Some employers would love to do that. They would love to, I've met some employers who make sure their employees have cars and a place to stay and things of that nature. We discussed a hometown hero by the name of Down North Pizza, and they assist with ex-convicts to get employment. They let them stay for free in the apartment that's attached to the restaurant until they get on their feet. So there are some great angel employers out there, but some people they want to protect what's theirs. So that's what was going on at that time. So what they did was they started to emphasize family allowance. So for those low-income families, it was a way for them to get out of the poverty, right? So in 1945, family allowances were introduced, and then minimum wages started moving away. And then I want to say around 1998, the National Minimum Wage Act was set. $3.60 per hour. That's euros. And younger workers got less, which is normally the way things go. So that's just a little bit of history in the UK. And then you have Latin America. And I want to say those laws were introduced around 1960. But the minimum wages, they're still pretty low. That was around the time the Alliance for Progress came about. That was pushed by President John F. K. And it really was set in place to kind of establish economic cooperation between Latin America and the U.S. And the governor of Puerto Rico at the time, they were kind of working with President Kennedy to get that going. But again, the minimum wage is still pretty low. Still a lot of work, I would say, needs to be done to help the citizens. This is not an issue, again, of it's just me and my home. This affects many people. If you think about the tourism industry in certain countries, and how little they're being paid and all the work that they're doing. I love when I go on vacation. I've harped on it many times in many episodes. I love vacation, and I love to tip the workers because I know for a fact they are not making as much as I believe they should. And so I always try to look out for them when I'm on vacation. But I'm just little old me. And I don't normally vacation very long. I'm one of those vacationers, after a certain time, I'm ready to go home now. So I don't stay too long. But when I am there, I try to tip as much as I can. Because I just know the circumstances. A lot of families are just trying to look out and see if there's a way out of, their dark place that they may be in. So that's why a lot of critics of those who oppose raising minimum wage go so hard, because you understand that there's families out there in need, right? All right, so let's hop into another country. Let's talk about Switzerland. And there was a referendum concerning a proposal to set the minimum wage at 22 Swiss francs, which is about $25. And that would have given Switzerland, the world's highest minimum wage. But they were defeated in that. And that's because, again, just because you raise the minimum wage does not mean that automatically creates no poverty. That doesn't mean that there will no longer be, those who take advantage. And then you also have to think, for those who can afford, a certain way of living, and now others can afford the same way of living, that does become competition for those who already experienced it. And now that creates less jobs. And so you have, again, like we stated, people looking to protect what they have and what's theirs. And that's kind of the crossroad that I feel that minimum wage puts you at. As you can see, different countries have tried to get their minimum wage up. As you can see, Switzerland, their referendum got overturned. I want to say in Australia, the wages board didn't set a universal minimum wage. It just set basic wages for the industries that they had. And that was around the early 1900s. And then I want to say the harvester decision was going on around that time as well. And that established the living wage, again, for a family with only 2 children. And this was a frugal way of living. So that means if this man is poor and he has a wife and he has 2 children, they should be able to survive off of this. Not live comfortably, but they should be able to survive off of this money. But then, you fast forward almost 100 years, and around 2005, the Australian Fair Pay Commission was established, and that kind of made the businesses more responsible for what they were paying their employees. And gave it a more standard federal, this is what it is across the board, instead of kind of going into different industries. Because my thought, now I'm just breaking down the data, the information, excuse me. If I give these 5 or 4 industries, you owe this, your employees this, you owe that, and you owe that. I can, depending on what I'm involved with, I can be a little bit biased on how I'm helping those industries fare, right? So I think that a basic minimum wage across the board is definitely necessary. Now we have some talks and some rumors of a universal basic pay, so across the board, no matter if you're in the U.S., you're in somewhere over in Asia, you're somewhere in Africa, the minimum wage would be this. I've seen some takes on that. I think that that'll be interesting because, as you know, currency fluctuates, so it'll be kind of funny to see how exactly it gets set to an even amount, and what would that mean for, the euro, the dollar? What would that mean for the currency if, there's a universal pay put in place? I like to think futuristic. I like, business predictions. I think that's pretty cool. So that's just some things I've been looking at, checking out different countries, seeing what they're doing right now, seeing if that trend will ever come to be. So right now we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get into the advantages and the disadvantages of minimum wage, right? Today we're talking everything minimum wage. There are the pros and the cons. So we're just going to get into some more research-based pros and cons outside of Moriah's takes, all right? So stay locked in. We'll be right back.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Back again. Today we're talking about minimum wage. We got into some history about minimum wage and how it kind of started. We dived deeper into a few different examples from other countries outside of the U.S. We talked about Australia, Switzerland, for example, Latin America, just giving some ideas of, how some other countries do things and how minimum wage is an issue across the board. It does not just include where you are. It goes into the debate of, is it fair? And I believe governments don't go by fair. I believe governments, or at least I believe governments should go by just, and not so much as fair, because what I see as fair, you might not think that that's fair, but if I look at something and say this is just and this is right, I think we can make more. We can meet more at a middle ground in that way. So I believe that's how governments should operate, and I believe that's how governments are trying to operate. With minimum wage, and with a lot of different topics, right? But specifically today, we talk about minimum wage. So let's get into some disadvantages and advantages. I like to get the bad out first. I'm one of those kind of people. Give me the bad news and then give me the good news. Don't give me the good news first. So let's get into some disadvantages of minimum wage. I would say the number one is that it can create more unemployment. So we briefly talked about that, with the competition. If the money goes up and we're all now making the same amount of money, even though I should have already been on my P's and Q's, now I have to be even more on my P's and Q's. Because I don't know if I'm going to be let go. I might have got lazy one day. What if I got lazy one day? I was just tired. I was at work. I was doing my job. I was just moving real slow. And another employee, they never take a day off. I mean, this employee, they don't even use their PTO. Do they get to stay because they didn't have a bad day? That's kind of how my mind works. So it can create some unemployment in a free labor market. Salaries, they reflect the willingness of what the employer is willing to pay the worker to do. So, again, that's a free labor market. And in those kind of markets, I cannot go below this a certain amount. So I might not be able, like I'm in PA, for example. I'm in Philly. I might not be able to go below $7.25 an hour. However, I can pay as much as I want to. If I wanted to pay you $100 an hour and you only work 10 hours a week and I can afford to do that, that's what I would do. If I wanted to pay you $7.50, if I wanted to pay you $7.26, right? That's exactly what I'm allowed to do. Now with restaurants, and those type of service industries, it's a little bit different. Those pays fluctuate. So it really depends on the industry. It really depends on the state. but it can create this this high level of unemployment. You know, individual productivity is really what employers are paying for. Can you get the job done? Can you do it within the time allotted? You might work a 9 to 5, so that's about 8 hours with a lunch. And can you get the job done? Are you able to do it for the pay that I'm giving? And in some states, there's at will employment. So if I feel like you're not doing a good job, you can go. And that's kind of how it gets handled in a way. So it can be a little scary. I would definitely call that a disadvantage, because if you set it at a certain rate for everyone, that can create some human, I'll say some human reactions. So you just want to be mindful of that. Legislation is always getting involved because of that. We're always talking about our unemployment rate. We want the unemployment rate to go down, because an unemployed society is not a productive society. So that's just one of the disadvantages, I would say, is that unemployment, puts everybody on the same playing field. Now, nothing wrong with that. It's just natural for ramifications to occur. So another disadvantage is it can disrupt the economic system. So the economies are ran off of the supply and demand. That's the meat and bone. That's the meat of what we're talking about, right? Supply and demand. This thing is in demand, we're going to supply it. And with minimum wage, it can kind of mess up that equilibrium if higher wages are imposed on other businesses. Your pricing now has to be adjusted. So the market isn't going to be the same as it was. Right now we're in a free market. Again, I can decide today I want to make, I want to sell lemonade. I love the way my grandma made her lemonade. I got the recipe. I lead with this is a family recipe passed down from generation to generation, and we use refined glass bottles. It keeps the lemonade fresh, and I have this great campaign going, and I decided to sell lemonade, and now I'm going up against country time, right? That's the type of society we live in. We have a free market. Now, my lemonade is in demand. I'm supplying this demand. I hire workers, but I'm still a small business, right? I'm a micro business. So I'm not really able to afford to pay my employees $17 to $20 an hour. I can afford minimum wage to $10 an hour. That's really all I can afford right now. And at some point, I'll be able to pay my employees more. I'll be able to give raises and bonuses and things of that nature. But the base start pay is $10 an hour. If I'm now being, told by the government that, hey, $10 an hour ain't enough. That's not cutting it. These people can't live. They can't survive off $10 an hour. We have to raise this to 15 or 20. Now I'm almost belly up, because I can't even afford to pay my employees. If I can't afford to pay my employees, now I have to let them go, or they're going to leave, because I know for me, if I don't get paid, I'm out. Like, what do you mean I'm not getting paid? I gave you my time, you're not going to pay me? No way. But that's how I see it. That's the society I've been brought up in. You get paid for what you do. So if that employer is not able to pay you, you got to let you go. Now I have less employees. Now I'm not able to supply my customers with all of these bottled lemonades. My customers will begin to leave. I begin to lose money. Now, obviously, this is an extreme example, but it's possible. So, it can disrupt the economy. It can disrupt your business's little small economy that it lives on, right? I like to think of businesses as little countries within this big continent of the umbrella of business. And within that continent, these little countries are trying to operate, and that's kind of how it goes. So if one country falls, it's going to create a domino effect of different businesses, right? A lot of different people are going to be affected. Again, with my lemonade example, I don't have enough employees to bottle these lemonade. Now I'm stuck. I'm stuck in a warehouse with inventory, and there's nothing I can do with it. And now the people who I get my bottles from, they lost the contract because I can't afford to buy anymore. And, they saw an increase in sales and now they're seeing a decrease. And now so you see what I mean? It's a constant effect. We're all connected. It's like the circle of life, right? We're all connected in some way. So, the minimum wage can definitely disrupt that. And it hurts the poor. Increasing the minimum wage is great and all. But for an individual that's earning money for their family, and that job is trying to increase the minimum wage, and now they may be getting more strict on the hiring process. It just, everyone's affected so much by this, and I always feel bad for the poor because I feel like they're the ones who are affected the most. It's, this is something that a raise in minimum wage should be able to help those in poverty, but a lot of experts are believing that it may end up actually hurting them. Because again, some can get hired, some can get fired, and now we're in this weird, sticky place, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. And then I would say one of the last disadvantages that I'll mention is it reduces other job benefits. So it wouldn't secure the low wage earners, from not being able to find work. So again, those that are in higher paying positions are now in competition with those who don't have the same skill set. And that creates a fight. Again, you're looking to protect what you have or what you earned or what you worked for. And then someone comes in, and just to be very blunt, they come in and kind of take what you have and have to work for it. That's kind of how people see it. So it reduces the benefits of saying, okay, I like this job. I'll deal with this job because of X, Y, and Z. And then that turns around right back on the employer because now we live in cancel culture. So you don't want to get caught slipping during this time. And if you're one of those employers who let an employee go because of something like this, it's just, you never know what the internet is going to find and how they're going to demonize something. So a lot of businesses are walking on eggshells. They're trying to be careful in what they do. I like a little bit of accountability, but the internet can be a crazy place. So a lot of businesses are looking to be careful. So there's going to be a lot of pushback on certain regulations looking to be changed. People might put up the idea that minimum wage should be a certain thing, and then might come back and realize that maybe what we were fighting for isn't so beneficial. So there's always room for change. I think that the disadvantages scream louder than the advantages. But let's get into some advantages. It can be helpful. Minimum wage can be helpful depending on the market. Again, even though we stated that some people might be put out of work, I do believe, like the stats were saying for the U.S., they're looking to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And that because of that, there's going to be an increase in about 17 million workers, but it's going to be a loss of about 1.4 million. I read that, I want to say it was a business news article, just some stats, just some experts playing around with the numbers, looking to see how exactly it's going to affect everyone. A lot of people are a little nervous. I can't say that I'm nervous, though. I mean, I like to think that in business we are forward thinking, and in business you have to be very creative. And there's ways to pivot around what you're doing, and you have to always be ahead of the curve in business. There's no room for catching up. You have to be ahead of the curve. So I think that although, minimum wage is a daunting conversation, I think it's pretty good. I think it's a way to keep everyone on their toes, keep everyone moving forward. But it can help. Again, more money, more spending, more productivity. It's a more productive society. So nothing wrong with that. And the tax burden. So people who are making minimum wage, they're not using public services as those who are unemployed. So if you are employed, chances of you using government assistance is lower. Now, that's not to say that people making minimum wage or more aren't getting some type of government assistance. But it would lead you to believe that less government assistance would be needed, which is less tax dollars being put out there. So those funds could be allocated to other places. It doesn't really burden that community so much because the whole population is using government assistance because the minimum wage is so low. So that's another advantage. It can help reduce some of the other effects. And it can help, it can help certain families out, like we said, having some more income it just feels better when you're able to really pay your bills and not have to worry about, I don't know how we're going to eat tomorrow. Also, another advantage will be for the employers. Having a minimum wage set in place, it really does help with the budget. If I know, everything else in business is up for discussion. But if as far as pricing and the demand, you might make a product that everyone hates, so you might have wasted some money. You might have did a few different things. But one thing I know for sure is that if there is a minimum wage I have to pay employees, I already know how much I need to make over that amount and how much I need for operation costs. So I think it will definitely help with budgeting. A lot of businesses go belly up because they can't budget. So I think, a minimum wage in place will allow for the business to figure out how many jobs they can make and how they can, give back to their community. I think that should be a big thing in businesses. It just allows you to be able to better understand how to allocate the funds. And it's an incentive to employees. If I know that job makes more than, a former minimum wage amount, or they at least pay minimum wage, and minimum wage is good, if I look at the minimum wage, I'm like, that's a good dollar amount. I'm more optimistic. I'm more prone to go out on job search. A lot of people stop job searching because they're just not sure if they're even going to get anything. They might be depressed because they've been turned down. So I think minimum wage is definitely beneficial. And everyone talks about how much you're paying for, when you're getting hired somewhere. So I think a minimum wage is a way to incentivize those looking for employment to get some great employees in. It helps employers budget their funds better. It lessens the tax burden. But some disadvantages are some people could get fired during this process. Some employers may go belly up if they can't afford the minimum wage. And those who are in those poor families, they're still going to be affected some way, somehow by an increase in minimum wage. Maybe the skills for certain jobs will go up if they're not educated because they have been poor and they couldn't afford education. They still might be at a disadvantage. So there's pros and cons to everything. We understand that, as is life, right? So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get into some specific examples of some minimum wage expectations, depending on the state that you're in, depending on if you're a student or if you're a disabled worker, things of that nature. So stay locked in. We'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Today we're talking about minimum wage. We got into some history of minimum wage and how, I want to say, around the world it seemed towards the early 1900s, around that serious industrial time, a lot of countries realized, and they were getting pushed on by their liberal citizens that, hey, there needs to be some type of minimum set If I'm going to work for this certain employer, I need to know how much I'm getting, so I know how I can move about my life. A lot of people don't like it, but the world is ruled by money. You need money to live. And if you try to operate outside of that, let me know how you're doing, because that's an interesting way to live your life. They're not saying get caught up in money, but understanding money, not being afraid of money, really understanding how it works and how it applies and things of that nature is very, very important. And down to your job, right? So you need a good job that pays good so that you can live good. I think that's everyone's goal, is, the pursuit of happiness. And that takes a little bit of change. You need a few dollars to pursue happiness, right? My vacations do not come for free. I wish they did. I wish I could just book a vacation and go, but I have to pay for that thing. So I have to work. I have to set aside my budget. I have to make a budget. I have to understand that, okay, I cannot afford to do this trip right now. I might be able to pay for it, but what has to sacrifice in order for me to go on this trip? So it's all about the budget, the vacation fund, the light fund, the food fund. Can you afford a car? Are you on public transportation? How are you going to pay for that transportation? You have to take a bath. So, who's paying for the water? How are you paying for the water? Do you get a discount for water? Are you getting government assistance for water? A lot of things get into play when money talks. Stress is involved. Divorces happen. Families break up when there's money issues. And you notice that in the poorer communities, those in impoverished areas, they are normally working jobs with minimum wage. There are fewer educated individuals in those areas, so the skill sets are lower. Then this is just statistical data. It may be unfortunate. This is just what it is. So those areas are depending, and they're looking for these kind of changes in legislation. Are you guys going to raise the minimum wage? And if so, by how much? And $15 an hour sounds good. Going from $7.25 in some areas, going from $2 check from a restaurant in other areas, but that's not coming until they're saying at least by 2025. So we're not sure if it's going to really be done or really be implemented by then. But this is just a window that I've heard about. I'm going to keep my eye on this topic as well. It's something interesting to think about. I am a business owner who is looking to eventually hire. So I need to be made aware of that. Can I afford to hire out? Do I have to keep operations small? Will I ever be able to scale if I can't afford the employees that are needed to help me to scale? It gets a little tricky. So this conversation of minimum wage it goes on the side of the employed, it goes on the side of the employer, and it goes for those who are unemployed, who are looking for employment, and just understand that, making under a certain amount isn't going to help them get out of their situation. Because, after you make a certain amount of money, you no longer qualify for certain benefits. So is it really advantageous of some individuals to get a job while the minimum wage is so low? So again, that conversation of the minimum wage is not as simple as let's raise this dollar amount and there's going to be more jobs and more opportunity and no more poverty. It's not that simple. It's very, very intricate, I would say. And, it just takes some good discussion, some real fact research before, shout out to those on the internet. Before you get into the back and forth, make sure you do your due diligence and figure out, what exactly it means. All right, so let's get into some exceptions of minimum wage. I know we talked about, understanding minimum wage and, it's legally mandated and, as of 2021, in the U.S., $7.25 an hour is minimum wage. And we also understand that that's only about $15K a year. And mortgages do not cost $15K, so that's out the window. And college is not $15K, so that's out the window. Although President Biden is trying to implement free community college, I think that's amazing. I wish I had that when I was in school. I would have took that route instead. no one can turn down free, right? But it does raise the question of the quality. Will it be more quality now that those things are free? Look at the public school system, for example. Those are just some side notes, right? All right, so let's hop right into it. So we understand what minimum wage is. We understand how it got started. We understand how it was in different states. We understand how it was in different countries, and how the government, they periodically look back and forth. It hasn't, I want to say it's in the U.S. it hasn't, the minimum wage hasn't increased since, I want to say, July of 2008, 2009. I want to say, yeah, because I had a few little odd end jobs, and I remember the minimum wage went up to $7.25. So I remember it was around $5.15, and then it went to $5.85, and then $6.55, and then finally $7.25, and it's been $7.25 for a little while now. So, it's definitely about that time for the conversation. About 10 years. It's about that time. It should have been raised, according to some advocates, but I'm glad that the discussion is happening. So again, what the government says should be the minimum wage is not necessarily what the state will say be the minimum wage, because it goes off of the cost of living for that region. So, for example, in PA, the minimum wage is $7.25. In Montana, it's $8.75, and in Massachusetts, it's $13.50. So every state has its own little jurisdiction, and they can go above the minimum wage, but they should not be below $7.25. If an employer is offering you below $7.25 in the U.S., run. Okay, that is not it. So there's some exceptions, right? So that first exception is the state, that it depends on the state you're in. You could, you don't have to pay $7.25, because you do have to go off of the cost of living. So certain jobs in PA, depending on the job itself, there's certain categories, and you have to work within your regulated space, right? So it's much more difficult than let's just raise the money, right? Much more difficult than that. So tip workers, they have a lower minimum wage of about $2.13. And that's what we talked about a little bit earlier. If you're in those service industries, your job is regulated differently because they're looking at the tips. If you get more than, I want to say, about $30 or $40 a month, that minimum wage goes into play. And what if you just hit that tip amount for the month, and that's all you got for the rest of the month, right? So it's a little dangerous. And then you get into your students. I remember being a student and you weren't able to work a certain amount of hours. I think you could work, it was a little while ago, maybe like 16, something like that. It was really low. I want to say maybe 20. No, 16 is being dramatic. I want to say it was 20 hours. You couldn't work more than that, and you had to be done at a certain time. So it was very difficult trying to find a job. School is out at a certain time, and I was very into my extracurriculars and my schoolwork. I was trying to go to college, so I knew I had to do a few other things. But at some point, I needed the money, so sports definitely took a back seat. Those are, remember those sacrifices that had to be made getting those jobs. Certain things do have to take a sacrifice. And, it really depends on the employer. Do they feel like dealing with high school kids or college kids whose schedules are not always, as steady as a mom of 3, or a dad with a wife and, 2 kids? We know they're coming to work. We know this wife who has a husband who works a lot. She has to help support, or, depending, no matter the situation you're in, you might have a roommate and you guys need a job, right? But if you're a certain age or you work for a certain position, there's certain hours put in place, there's certain dollar amounts put in place. I want to say at one job I had applied for, if you were under 18, you made a certain amount. You had to be 14 to work there, but if you were under 18, you made a certain amount, and if you were over that, you made a certain amount. And then unfortunately, you have some individuals with disabilities, and according to the FLSA, they can be paid less than the minimum wage because of the production capacity. So if you're blind or legally blind, you have a certain type of drug or alcohol addiction, disabilities that are developing, you can be paid less than the minimum wage, unfortunately. So that's why people advocate so much for the minimum wage to grow, for it to go up, for there to be a way to just really streamline the pay. Like, what's the dollar amount we can all be paid and that we can all live comfortably, right? It's not as easy as it seems. It's not as easy as it sounds. And I hope the listeners understand that. I hope this episode, even if you didn't agree with anything I said, I hope you really took the time to do your own research and do your own due diligence to really get into this topic. It affects everyone. It even affects down to the consumer. Remember the lemonade example I gave. If we can't produce the lemonade anymore, consumers are upset. They're going to go to the competition. They're going to go to whoever can supply the demand. So minimum wage is not a one-stop shop. It has many branches and goes into many other industries, and it affects everyone. So thank you so much for listening today to the GSMC Business News Podcast, powered by the GSMC Podcast Network. Again, I'm your girl, Moriah. Please make sure you like, share, subscribe, leave a review. Follow us on Twitter. We're constantly tweeting about crypto. I've been on the crypto wave, so some good tweets about that. Then we have some other podcasts out there. We have, the sports. We have TV. We have love. We have religion. So be sure, in addition to the business podcast, make sure you're checking out some of the other podcasts that GSMC has to offer, all right? Thanks for tuning in. Peace.